The rain was coming down hard that Tuesday morning when Jake stepped off the city bus. His old backpack was soaked through and water dripped from his hair into his eyes. He stood there for a moment looking up at the big glass building in front of him. The sign read, Rosewood Music Academy in fancy gold letters. Jake had been carrying that newspaper clipping in his pocket for 3 weeks now. It was all wrinkled and soft from being folded and unfolded so many times. The ad talked about scholarships for kids who couldn't afford music lessons. It seemed too good to be true, but Jake had nothing left to lose. His sneakers squeaked on the shiny marble floor as he walked through the front doors. Everything inside was so clean and expensive looking. There were crystal chandeliers hanging from the ceiling and paintings of famous musicians on the walls. Jake felt like he didn't belong there at all. The woman at the front desk looked up when she heard his wet shoes. She had perfectly styled hair and was wearing a suit that probably cost more than Jake's family made in a month. Her smile disappeared the second she saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked. But her tone made it clear she didn't really want to help. Jake pulled out the crumpled newspaper clipping and placed it on her desk. "I'm here about the scholarship program," he said quietly. The woman barely looked at the paper. "Oh, those auditions ended back in February. It's May now. You're way too late." Jake's heart sank. He had saved up for weeks just to get the bus fare to come here. His grandmother had been so excited when he told her about the scholarship. She had even given him her lucky penny to carry with him. "But I can play," Jake said, his voice getting smaller. "I've been teaching myself for years." The receptionist let out a little laugh. "Sweetheart, everyone thinks they can play. This is a serious music school. We have students who've been taking lessons since they were 3 years old." Jake felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Other people in the lobby were starting to stare. There were kids his age walking around with fancy instrument cases, and they all looked like they belonged there. Their clothes were clean and new, and they talked with confidence. "I understand," Jake said, starting to back away from the desk. "Thanks anyway." Just then, a door opened behind the reception area. A woman with silver hair pulled back in a tight bun came walking out. She was wearing all black and had the kind of face that looked like it never smiled. Jake could tell right away that she was important just by the way she carried herself. "What's all this noise about?" the woman asked, looking directly at Jake. The receptionist quickly spoke up. "Professor Chen, this young man was just leaving. He thought he could audition for the scholarship program, but I explained that the deadline was months ago." Professor Chen studied Jake for a long moment. Her dark eyes seemed to see right through him. Jake wanted to disappear into the floor. "Where are you from?" Professor Chen asked him. "East Side," Jake answered honestly. "Down by the old factory district." Professor Chen nodded slowly. "That's a long way to come just to be turned away." She looked at the newspaper clipping still sitting on the desk. "What instrument do you play?" "Piano," Jake said. "Well, I try to. I practice on an old keyboard my grandmother bought at a yard sale. Half the keys don't work right anymore." Some of the students in the lobby started whispering to each other. One of them actually laughed out loud. Jake felt his face get hot again. Professor Chen held up her hand and the whispering stopped immediately. "The scholarship auditions are closed," she said. "That's true." Jake's shoulders dropped. He had been hoping against hope that maybe she would make an exception. "However," Professor Chen continued, "I'm curious about something. You came all this way in the rain? You saved up money for bus fare. You've been carrying that newspaper clipping around for weeks. That tells me you really want this." Jake nodded eagerly. "I do. Music is everything to me. It's the only thing I'm good at." Professor Chen walked over to the lobby area where a beautiful black piano sat in the corner. It was the most gorgeous instrument Jake had ever seen. The wood was so shiny he could see his reflection in it. "This is a Steinway grand piano," Professor Chen said, running her hand along its edge. "It's worth more than most people's cars. I've been teaching piano for 30 years, and I've seen thousands of students come and go." Jake didn't know what to say, so he just listened. Most of them had every advantage. Private lessons from age 5. Perfect technique. Wealthy parents who could afford the best teachers. Professor Chen looked directly at Jake again. "But you know what most of them didn't have?" "What?" Jake asked. "Heart," she said. "Real passion. The kind that makes you practice on broken keys and dream about music even when everyone tells you it's impossible." The lobby had gotten very quiet. Even the other students had stopped talking. Professor Chen made a decision that surprised everyone, including herself. "I'll make you a deal," she said. "It's not fair and it's definitely not normal, but I'm going to give you one chance." Jake's eyes went wide. "Really?" "Play this piano," Professor Chen said, gesturing to the Steinway. "Right here, right now, in front of everyone. If you can show me that you have real talent, not just dreams, then I'll find a way to get you into our program." The other students started murmuring again. Some of them looked shocked. Others seemed excited to see what would happen. But Professor Chen, the receptionist, said, "The rules clearly state that—" "I make the rules in my department," Professor Chen cut her off. "This young man traveled across the city to be here. The least we can do is listen." Jake stared at the piano. It was intimidating and beautiful at the same time. He had never played on anything so expensive or perfect. What if he messed up? What if his hands shook? What if everyone laughed at him? But then he thought about his grandmother. She had worked double shifts at the diner for months to save up enough money to buy him that old keyboard. She believed in him when nobody else did. She always said that talent would find a way to shine through no matter what. "Okay," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'll try." Professor Chen stepped back and crossed her arms. "The floor is yours," she said. Jake walked slowly toward the piano bench. Every step felt like it took forever. The other students, the receptionist, and Professor Chen were all watching him. Some people had even come out of classrooms to see what was happening. His hands were shaking as he sat down on the bench. The piano keys looked perfect and untouched. Jake took a deep breath and tried to calm his nerves. This was it. This was his one shot. Everything he had dreamed about for years came down to this moment. If he failed, he would have to go back home and accept that music would always just be a hobby for him. But if he succeeded, Jake placed his fingers on the keys and prepared to play the most important performance of his life. The piano bench was softer than anything Jake had ever sat on. At home, he practiced on an old wooden chair that wobbled and creaked with every movement. This felt like sitting on a cloud, but that just made him more nervous. Professor Chen stood about 10 feet away, her arms still crossed. Her face showed no emotion at all. Jake couldn't tell if she was hoping he would succeed or fail. The other students had formed a loose circle around the piano area. Some of them were trying to look supportive, but Jake could see the doubt in their eyes. A girl with blonde hair whispered to her friend, "This is going to be embarrassing. He probably doesn't even know how to read music." Her friend nodded. "Professor Chen is just being nice. She'll let him play for a minute and then find a polite way to say no." Jake heard every word, and it made his stomach twist into knots. Maybe they were right. Maybe he was fooling himself. The keyboard at home was so different from this beautiful piano. What if his fingers didn't work the same way on these perfect keys? "Take your time," Professor Chen said. But Jake could hear the impatience starting to creep into her voice. "Whenever you're ready." Jake looked down at his hands. They were shaking slightly, and he could see dirt under his fingernails from helping his grandmother with her garden that morning. Everyone else here probably had manicured hands that had never done any real work. He closed his eyes and tried to remember why he was here. It wasn't just about the scholarship. It wasn't even about proving himself to these people. It was about the music itself. Music had always been his escape, his way of making sense of the world. When Jake was 8 years old, his parents had died in a car accident. He went to live with his grandmother in her tiny apartment. Those first few months were the darkest time of his life. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, couldn't even cry anymore. Then his grandmother brought home that old keyboard from a yard sale. "I thought you might like this," she had said, setting it up in the corner of his small bedroom. "The lady who sold it to me said her grandson used to play it." Jake had no idea how to play piano, but something about the keys drew him in. He started pressing them randomly at first, just enjoying the sounds they made. Slowly, he began to figure out which keys sounded good together. He spent hours every day exploring the keyboard, learning its language. Now sitting at this incredible piano, Jake tried to remember that feeling of discovery. Music wasn't about impressing people or following rules. It was about expressing something that couldn't be said with words. He opened his eyes and placed his hands on the keys. The first note he played was soft and gentle. It echoed through the lobby like a whisper. Then he played another note and another. Slowly, a melody began to emerge. Jake had never had formal lessons, so he didn't know the names of the scales or the proper finger positions. But he had spent 7 years listening to music and figuring out how to recreate it. He had learned to play by feeling rather than by sight. The song he chose was one he had written himself. It didn't have a name because Jake didn't know you were supposed to name songs. He just thought of it as the one that sounds like missing someone. It was the melody that came to him whenever he thought about his parents. As Jake played, something magical started to happen. The nervousness began to fade away. His hands stopped shaking. The beautiful tone of the Steinway piano made his simple melody sound richer and more powerful than it ever had on his old keyboard. Professor Chen's expression started to change. The skeptical look in her eyes was replaced by something else. Surprise, maybe, or curiosity. She took a step closer to the piano. The students around them had stopped whispering. One by one, they were drawn into the music Jake was creating. The melody was simple, but it carried so much emotion that it was impossible to ignore. Jake began to add harmony with his left hand. He had taught himself to do this by listening to songs on the radio and trying to figure out what made them sound full and complete. His technique wasn't perfect, but the feeling behind it was genuine. The song built slowly like a story being told. It started with sadness and longing, but gradually became more hopeful. Jake's fingers found their way to brighter notes, creating a sense of light breaking through darkness. Professor Chen was now standing right next to the piano. She was watching Jake's hands move across the keys with growing amazement. In 30 years of teaching, she had heard thousands of students play. Most of them had been technically skilled but emotionally empty. This was the opposite. Jake was playing with his whole heart. Every note meant something to him. He wasn't just pressing keys. He was sharing a piece of his soul with everyone in that room. The receptionist had stopped shuffling papers and was listening intently. A few teachers had come out of their classrooms, drawn by the unexpected concert happening in the lobby. Even the janitor had stopped mopping and was leaning on his mop handle, completely absorbed in the music. As the song reached its climax, Jake's playing became more confident. The Steinway piano responded to his touch like it was alive. The sound filled every corner of the lobby, rich and warm and heartbreakingly beautiful. But then, as suddenly as it had begun, Jake brought the melody back down to a whisper. The final notes hung in the air like a prayer, gradually fading into silence. Jake lifted his hands from the keys and sat very still. He wasn't sure what to do next. The lobby was completely quiet. Not a single person was moving or speaking. Professor Chen stared at Jake for what felt like forever. Her usual stern expression was gone, replaced by something Jake couldn't quite read. She looked like someone who had just witnessed something impossible. "Who taught you to play like that?" she asked quietly. Jake looked up at her, still not sure if what had just happened was good or bad. "Nobody," he said honestly. "I just figured it out on my own." Professor Chen shook her head slowly. "That's not possible. The harmony, the phrasing, the emotional depth, that takes years of training to develop." "I've been playing for 7 years," Jake said. "Every day. Sometimes for hours. On what? That broken keyboard you mentioned." Jake nodded. "And sometimes I go to the community center. They have an old upright piano that I can use when nobody else is around." Professor Chen looked like she was trying to solve a complicated puzzle. Everything she knew about music education told her that what Jake had just done shouldn't be possible. Students didn't develop that kind of musical sensitivity without proper instruction. "Play something else," she said suddenly. Jake blinked. "What? Play something else?" "Something different. I need to know if that was just luck." The crowd of students and teachers was growing. Word was spreading through the building that something unusual was happening in the lobby. Jake could feel all their eyes on him, but somehow the pressure didn't feel as overwhelming as it had before. He thought for a moment, then placed his hands back on the keys. This time he chose a piece he had learned by listening to a classical radio station. He didn't know it was called Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. He just knew it as the one that sounds like moonlight on water. Jake's interpretation was unlike anything Professor Chen had ever heard. It wasn't technically perfect, but it was deeply personal. He played the piece as if he had written it himself, finding new meanings in every phrase. As the beautiful melody flowed from the piano, Professor Chen made a decision that would change both their lives forever. As the last notes of the classical piece faded away, the lobby remained frozen in complete silence. Jake's hands were still resting on the piano keys, and he could feel his heart pounding in his chest. He had poured everything he had into those 2 songs, and now he waited for judgment. Professor Chen stood motionless beside the piano. Her usual stern expression had completely disappeared, replaced by something Jake had never seen before. Her eyes were wide, and for just a moment she looked almost vulnerable. "That was Debussy," she whispered, more to herself than to Jake. "You just played Debussy like you understood every single note he wrote." Jake looked up at her with confusion. "I don't know who that is. I heard it on the radio at my grandmother's house. She likes to listen to the classical station while she cooks." The admission sent a ripple of amazement through the growing crowd. Professor Chen felt her carefully constructed world of music theory and formal training begin to shift. Here was a young man who had never heard of Claude Debussy, one of the most important composers in history, yet he had just performed Clair de Lune with more genuine emotion than most of her advanced students. "How is this possible?" Professor Chen asked, speaking louder now so others could hear. "You have no formal training, no understanding of music theory, no knowledge of the composers, yet you play with more musicality than students who have been studying for years." Jake shifted uncomfortably on the piano bench. "I just listen to how the music makes me feel, and then I try to make other people feel the same way." A tall man with a beard pushed through the crowd. Jake recognized him as one of the teachers who had come out of the classrooms. "Professor Chen," the man said, "what's happening here? I've never heard anything like that coming from the lobby." "Dr. Rodriguez," Professor Chen said, her voice still filled with disbelief. "This young man just walked in off the street. No formal training whatsoever, and he just played 2 pieces that would challenge our advanced students." Dr. Rodriguez looked at Jake with new interest. "Really? What level are you, son?" "I don't know what that means," Jake answered honestly. "I just play what I like." Dr. Rodriguez exchanged a meaningful look with Professor Chen. In their combined 40 years of teaching, they had never encountered anything like this. Students at Rosewood Academy came from privileged backgrounds with years of expensive lessons. They could sight-read complex pieces and understood every aspect of music theory. But most of them played mechanically, without the raw emotional power that Jake had just demonstrated. "Play something happy," said a voice from the crowd. Jake looked over and saw a girl about his age with curly red hair. She was smiling at him encouragingly. "That last song was beautiful, but it made me want to cry. Can you play something that makes people want to dance?" Jake thought for a moment, then grinned. "I know just the thing." He launched into an upbeat jazz-influenced piece that he had created by combining melodies he heard from different songs on the radio. His left hand played a bouncing bass line while his right hand danced across the higher keys with playful, syncopated rhythms. The effect was immediate. Several people in the crowd started tapping their feet. The girl with curly hair began swaying to the music. Even Professor Chen found herself nodding along to the infectious rhythm. Jake's face lit up as he played. This was the kind of music that reminded him of good times with his grandmother. She would put on old records and dance around their tiny kitchen while making dinner. Sometimes she would grab Jake's hands and spin him around until they were both laughing and dizzy. "That's incredible," Dr. Rodriguez said, raising his voice over the music. "He's improvising. Do you realize how difficult that is?" Professor Chen was beginning to understand something important. Jake didn't just play music. He spoke music as fluently as his native language. While other students had to think about finger positions and note values, Jake simply felt the music and let it flow through him. As the jazzy piece reached its conclusion, Jake threw in a few playful flourishes that made several people in the crowd laugh with delight. When he finished, the silence that followed was different from before. Instead of stunned shock, there was anticipation. People wanted to hear more. "Absolutely remarkable," said another voice. Jake turned to see an elderly woman with silver hair making her way through the crowd. She was elegantly dressed and carried herself with obvious authority. "Mrs. Whitman," Professor Chen said, and Jake could hear the respect in her voice. "I didn't know you were here today." "I was meeting with the board of directors," Mrs. Whitman replied. "But I heard music unlike anything I've experienced in this building for years." "Who is this young man?" Professor Chen looked at Jake, realizing she didn't even know his full name. "This is Jake," he said, standing up from the piano bench and extending his hand politely. "Jake Thompson." Mrs. Whitman shook his hand warmly. "Jake, I'm Margaret Whitman. I founded this academy 30 years ago. In all that time, I've heard thousands of auditions and performances. What you just did..." She paused, searching for the right words. "What you just did was pure magic." Jake felt his cheeks burning with embarrassment. Thank you, ma'am. I'm just glad people liked it. Liked it? Mrs. Whitman laughed. My dear boy, you have a gift that comes along once in a generation. Professor Chen, please tell me you're going to find a way to accept this young man into our program. Professor Chen looked around at the faces surrounding them. Students, teachers, staff members. Everyone was looking at her expectantly. The normal admission procedures seemed suddenly ridiculous in the face of what they had all just witnessed. Jake, Professor Chen said, turning to face him directly, I need to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. Why do you want to study music? Is it for fame, money, to impress people? Jake thought carefully before answering. My grandmother always said that everyone has something special to give to the world. For some people, it's being good with numbers or fixing things or helping sick people get better. For me, it's music. When I play, I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do, and when other people listen and it makes them feel something good, then I know I'm using my gift the right way. The honesty in his voice touched everyone who heard it. This wasn't a young man looking for an easy path to success. This was someone who understood that talent came with responsibility. Mrs. Whitman wiped a tear from her eye. Professor Chen, if you don't accept this boy immediately, I will personally override your decision. Professor Chen smiled for the first time since Jake had arrived. Actually, Mrs. Whitman, I was just about to say that the scholarship program has room for one more student. A cheer went up from the crowd. The girl with curly hair clapped her hands excitedly. Dr. Rodriguez was beaming. Even the receptionist who had been so dismissive earlier was smiling. Jake felt dizzy with disbelief. Are you serious? I really get to study here? On one condition, Professor Chen said, her stern expression returning for a moment. You'll be starting far behind the other students in terms of formal knowledge. You'll need to work twice as hard as everyone else to catch up on music theory, sight reading, and proper technique. I'll work 10 times as hard if I have to, Jake said eagerly. Professor Chen's smile returned. I believe you will. Welcome to Rosewood Academy, Jake Thompson. As the crowd began to disperse, buzzing with excitement about what they had just witnessed, Jake sat back down at the piano. He couldn't believe this was really happening. He touched the keys gently as if making sure the beautiful instrument was real. Professor Chen, he said quietly, yes? Thank you for giving me a chance. I promise I won't let you down. Professor Chen placed a hand on his shoulder. Jake, something tells me you're going to surprise all of us with what you can accomplish. Looking around the elegant lobby that would soon become familiar to him, Jake felt like his real life was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since Jake's impromptu audition in the lobby, and he was beginning to understand what Professor Chen meant when she said he would have to work twice as hard as everyone else. Every day brought new challenges that made his head spin. Music theory was like learning a foreign language. While other students tossed around terms like diminished sevenths and secondary dominants as easily as discussing the weather, Jake struggled to understand what they meant. He spent his evenings at the library, checking out books with titles he could barely pronounce, trying to catch up on knowledge that his classmates had been absorbing for years. Jake, can you identify the key signature of this piece? Professor Chen asked during his private lesson that Thursday afternoon. Jake stared at the sheet music in front of him. The little symbols at the beginning of the staff might as well have been hieroglyphics. It has 3 sharps? Correct. And what key does that indicate? Jake's mind went blank. He had studied this just last night, but all the different keys and their signatures kept getting mixed up in his head. Is it a major? Professor Chen sighed gently. A major has 3 sharps, yes. But this piece is written in the relative minor, which would be F sharp minor, Jake said, the answer suddenly coming to him. Exactly. See, you're learning. It just takes practice. But Jake could see the concern in Professor Chen's eyes, even though she was trying to hide it. The other scholarship students were progressing much faster than he was. They had solid foundations to build on, while Jake felt like he was constructing a house without knowing how to lay bricks. The academic challenges were only part of the problem. Fitting in socially was proving to be just as difficult. Most of the students at Rosewood Academy came from wealthy families who lived in neighborhoods Jake had only seen in movies. They talked casually about summer homes and European vacations and private tutors. During lunch, Jake usually sat by himself in the corner of the cafeteria. He brought peanut butter sandwiches from home, while other students bought expensive salads and gourmet wraps. He tried to join conversations, but he often felt like he was missing important context. "Did you hear that Vincent Zhao is performing at Carnegie Hall next month?" said Tommy, a violin student who always wore designer clothes. "My parents know his family. We're all going to the after party." "That's amazing," replied Ashley, a flute player with perfectly styled blonde hair. "I met him at music camp in Switzerland last summer." "He's incredibly talented." Jake had no idea who Vincent Zhao was, and he had never heard of music camp in Switzerland. He ate his sandwich quietly and pretended to read his music theory textbook. The girl with curly red hair who had asked him to play something happy on his first day sometimes smiled at him in the hallways. Her name was Riley, and she seemed friendlier than most of the other students. But even she moved in social circles that Jake couldn't access. "Hey Jake," Riley said one day after their music history class. "A bunch of us are going to see the symphony this weekend. Want to come?" Jake's heart jumped at the invitation. But then reality set in. "How much are the tickets?" "Only $40, Riley said casually. $40 was more than Jake had to spend on anything unnecessary. His grandmother was already stretching their budget to cover his bus fare to school every day. "Thanks for asking," he said, "but I can't make it." Riley looked disappointed but didn't push. Jake watched her walk away with her friends, chattering excitedly about the upcoming concert. That evening, Jake sat at the old keyboard in his grandmother's apartment, feeling more discouraged than he had since starting at the academy. Maybe Professor Chen had made a mistake. Maybe raw talent wasn't enough to succeed in this world. "How was school today, sweetheart?" his grandmother asked, bringing him a cup of hot chocolate. "It's really hard, Grandma," Jake admitted. "Everyone else knows so much more than I do. And they all have money for things I can't afford. Sometimes I wonder if I belong there." His grandmother sat down on his bed and looked at him seriously. "Jake, do you remember when you first started playing piano?" "Yeah, I was 8. Do you remember why you kept playing even when it was frustrating?" Jake thought back to those early days. "Because it made me feel better. When I was sad about Mom and Dad, playing music helped." "And does it still make you feel that way?" "When I'm actually playing, yes. But all this other stuff, the theory and the reading music and trying to fit in with rich kids, and that doesn't feel like music anymore." His grandmother nodded wisely. "You know, when I was your age, I wanted to be a nurse. But my family didn't have money for nursing school. I thought I'd never get the chance." Jake had never heard this story before. "What happened?" "I found a job at a hospital doing laundry and cleaning. It wasn't glamorous, but it got me in the door. I watched the nurses work, and I asked them questions, and I learned as much as I could. Eventually, one of the doctors noticed how much I knew and helped me get into a program for working students." "So, you became a nurse?" "I did, and you know what I learned? It doesn't matter how you get the knowledge as long as you get it. It doesn't matter if other people had advantages you didn't have. What matters is that you care enough to keep trying." Jake considered his grandmother's words. "But what if I'm never as good as the other students?" "Jake, I heard you play that day before you left for your audition. You were practicing that sad song you wrote, the one about missing your parents. I stood outside your door and listened, and I cried. Not because I was sad, but because you had turned your pain into something beautiful that could touch other people's hearts." She paused and took his hands in hers. "Those other students might know more about music theory than you do. They might be able to read complicated sheet music better than you can. But can they make people feel the way you do when you play? Can they take their own experiences and turn them into music that speaks to everyone who hears it?" Jake felt a spark of his old confidence returning. "Professor Chen said something like that on my first day. She said most students had technique but no heart." "Exactly. And heart is something you can't buy no matter how much money your parents have." The next day at school, Jake approached his studies with renewed determination. Instead of feeling ashamed about what he didn't know, he started asking more questions. When other students talked about composers he had never heard of, he wrote down their names and looked them up later. During music theory class, instead of sitting silently when he didn't understand something, he raised his hand. "Professor Williams," Jake said, "I'm having trouble understanding how diminished chords work. Could you explain it again?" Some of the other students looked annoyed that he was slowing down the class, but Professor Williams seemed pleased by the question. "Of course. Jake, let me break it down in simpler terms." After class, Riley approached him. "That was a good question," she said. "I didn't want to admit it, but I was confused about that too." "Really? Really? Just because we've been studying longer doesn't mean we understand everything perfectly. That afternoon, during his private lesson with Professor Chen, Jake decided to be completely honest about his struggles. "Professor Chen, I need to tell you something. I'm having a really hard time with all the theory and sight reading, and I feel like I don't fit in with the other students. Maybe you made a mistake accepting me." Professor Chen set down her pen and looked at him intently. "Jake, do you remember what you played on your first day here?" "Yes, ma'am." "Close your eyes and remember how that felt. Not the nervousness or the pressure, but the actual moment when you were playing." Jake closed his eyes and thought back to that day. He could almost feel the smooth keys of the Steinway under his fingers again. It felt like I was speaking my native language, exactly. And that's something that can't be taught. Yes, you need to learn theory and sight reading. Those are tools that will make you a more complete musician. But your gift, your ability to communicate emotion through music, that's already fully developed. She paused and smiled at him. "Jake, I've been teaching for 30 years. I've had students who could sight read anything you put in front of them, who knew every scale and chord progression by heart. Most of them became competent musicians. A few became successful performers. But I've only had one or two who could do what you did that first day. Make everyone in the room stop what they were doing and just listen." Jake opened his eyes and felt tears forming. "So you don't regret accepting me?" "Regret it? Jake, you're going to be one of the most important students I ever teach. Mark my words." As Jake left his lesson that day, he felt like a weight had been lifted from his shoulders. The academic challenges were still there, and he would still have to work harder than everyone else to catch up. But now he understood that his different background wasn't just an obstacle to overcome. It was also the source of his greatest strength. Walking through the elegant hallways of Rosewood Academy, Jake no longer felt like an outsider looking in. He belonged here, not because he could afford to be here, but because he had something valuable to contribute. His music had already touched people's hearts, and he was just getting started. 8 months had passed since that rainy Tuesday when Jake first walked through the doors of Rosewood Academy. Now, as he sat backstage at the Whitman Concert Hall preparing for his first major recital, he could hardly believe how much his life had changed. The program in his hands listed him as Jake Thompson, first-year scholarship student. Below his name was the title of the piece he would be performing, Grandmother's Kitchen, an original composition. It was the first time in the Academy's history that a first-year student had been allowed to perform their own work at the annual spring recital. "5 minutes until you're on," said Mrs. Patterson, the stage manager. She smiled at him warmly. "How are you feeling?" "Nervous," Jake admitted, wiping his sweaty palms on his black dress pants. His grandmother had bought him his first real suit for this performance, and he kept tugging at the tie that felt strange around his neck. Through a gap in the stage curtains, Jake could see the concert hall filling up with families and friends. The seats were covered in red velvet, and crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over everything. He spotted his grandmother in the third row, wearing her best dress and beaming with pride. She had invited Mrs. Rodriguez from next door, and Mr. Kim from the grocery store where she shopped. They were all chatting excitedly, clearly thrilled to be there. In the months since his audition, Jake had thrown himself into his studies with incredible determination. The music theory that once seemed impossible was finally starting to make sense. He could now identify key signatures without hesitation, and even understood those complicated chord progressions that used to confuse him. But more importantly, he had learned to blend his natural musical instincts with formal technique. Professor Chen had worked with him to develop proper finger positioning and posture, without destroying the emotional authenticity that made his playing special. The key, Professor Chen had told him during one of their lessons, is to use technique as a tool to express your musical ideas more clearly, not to replace your natural instincts. Jake had also found his place socially at the academy. It turned out that his honesty about his background, rather than making him an outsider, had actually inspired several other students to be more genuine about their own struggles. Riley had become a close friend, and she had helped him navigate the social aspects of academy life. "You know what I like about you?" Riley had said one day over lunch. "You never pretend to be something you're not. Half the kids here are so worried about maintaining some perfect image that they never let anyone see who they really are." Tommy, the violin student who had once seemed so intimidating with his designer clothes and talk of Carnegie Hall, had surprised Jake by asking for advice about performing with more emotion. "I can play all the notes perfectly," Tommy had confessed, But when I listen to you play, I realize I'm not really saying anything with my music. How do you make people feel something when you perform?" These conversations had led to the formation of an informal study group, where students helped each other with different aspects of musicianship. Jake tutored others in emotional expression and improvisation, while they helped him with sight reading and music history. The success of this collaboration had caught the attention of Mrs. Whitman, who had approached Professor Chen with an idea. "I think Jake has given us an opportunity to rethink our approach to music education," Mrs. Whitman had said. "Perhaps we've been too focused on technical perfection and not enough on developing the whole musician." This conversation had led to the creation of a new outreach program designed to identify and nurture musical talent in underserved communities. Jake had been asked to help design the curriculum, sharing his insights about how people could develop musicality even without formal training. "We want to find the next Jake Thompson," Mrs. Whitman had explained, "but we also want to make sure we're not overlooking talented young people just because they don't fit our traditional expectations." Now, as Jake prepared to perform the piece that had grown out of all these experiences, he reflected on how much he had learned about himself and about music. Grandmother's Kitchen was a musical story about the small apartment where he had grown up, but it was also about love, resilience, and the way beautiful things could emerge from humble circumstances. The piece began with a simple melody that represented his grandmother humming while she cooked. Gradually, other musical voices joined in, neighbors talking in the hallway, children playing outside, the distant sound of traffic. But at the heart of the composition was the old keyboard in the corner, represented by a recurring theme that wove through all the other elements. Jake had written the piece to show how music could transform any space into something magical, how even the smallest home could be filled with beauty if someone cared enough to create it. "Places, everyone," Mrs. Patterson announced. "Jake, you're up first." Jake stood up and walked toward the stage entrance, his legs feeling slightly unsteady. As he passed Professor Chen, she placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember," she said quietly, "you're not performing for the audience. You're sharing something important with friends, just like you did that first day in the lobby." Jake nodded and stepped onto the stage. The concert hall looked enormous from this perspective, with hundreds of faces looking up at him expectantly. The Steinway grand piano sat center stage, illuminated by a single spotlight. As he walked toward the piano bench, Jake spotted familiar faces in the audience. There was Dr. Rodriguez, who had become one of his biggest supporters. Mrs. Whitman was sitting in the front row, her eyes shining with anticipation. Riley and several of his study group friends were in the student section, giving him encouraging smiles. But his eyes kept returning to his grandmother, who was clutching her purse in her lap and looking like she might burst with pride at any moment. Jake sat down at the piano and adjusted the bench to the right height. The audience grew quiet, waiting for him to begin. For just a moment he felt the old nervousness returning. Then he thought about everything that had brought him to this moment: the broken keyboard, the long bus ride in the rain, the hours of practice, the support of people who believed in him. He placed his hands on the keys and began to play. The opening notes of Grandmother's Kitchen filled the concert hall with gentle warmth. Jake could feel the audience settling in to listen as the simple melody unfolded. But this time, unlike his first performance at the Academy, Jake wasn't nervous about making mistakes or impressing anyone. He was simply sharing a story that mattered to him. As the piece progressed, building layers of harmony and rhythm that represented the life and energy of his childhood home, Jake could see people in the audience responding emotionally. Some were smiling at the playful sections that depicted children's laughter. Others were visibly moved by the tender passages that spoke of quiet, moments between a grandmother and her grandson. When Jake reached the climax of the piece, a section where all the musical themes came together, in a joyful celebration of family and community, he could feel the entire concert hall connected to the story he was telling. The final section brought the music back to that simple melody his grandmother hummed while cooking, but now it was enriched by everything that had come before. As the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. Then the applause began. It started slowly, with a few people clapping, but quickly built into something thunderous. The entire audience was on their feet, and Jake could see tears in many eyes, including his grandmother's. As Jake stood up from the piano bench and took his bow, He realized that this moment represented more than just a successful performance. It was proof that music could bridge any gap between rich and poor, trained and untrained, different backgrounds and experiences. Professor Chen appeared at his side as the applause continued. "Jake," she said, her voice filled with emotion, "that was extraordinary. You've just shown everyone here what music education should really be about." Later, at the reception following the concert, Jake was surrounded by people wanting to congratulate him and hear more about his journey. But the moment that meant the most to him was when his grandmother pulled him aside. "Jake," she said, tears still fresh in her eyes, "your parents would be so proud of you, not just because you played beautifully, but because you've stayed true to who you are. I couldn't have done any of this without you, Grandma. You believed in me when nobody else did." She hugged him tightly. "I just provided the keyboard, sweetheart. The music was always inside you." As the evening wound down and Jake changed out of his formal clothes, he thought about the future. He had 3 more years at Rosewood Academy, and he planned to make the most of every opportunity. But he also knew that his real mission was bigger than just his own success. The outreach program he was helping to develop would launch next fall, and Jake would be visiting schools in underserved communities, looking for young people who might have musical gifts that traditional audition processes would miss. He wanted to make sure that other kids like him wouldn't have to wait until they were 17 to get a real chance to develop their talents. Standing in the empty concert hall after everyone had left, Jake walked back to the piano one more time. He sat down and